Dr. Drew Hart is a former pastor and current theology professor at Messiah College in Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania. He describes himself as an Anablactivist, a term combining Anabaptist, black theology, and activism. His 2016 book, The Troubles I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, was an early guidepost in my journey towards a world that embodies God's justice. Like many of the books popping up on reading lists this past summer, Trouble I've Seen explores the racist structures of America partially through memoir, with Dr. Hart expounding on his own personal experiences with racism and racist structures in the U.S., which is probably clear from the title. It's quite literally an exploration of the trouble Hart himself has seen. But it's trouble anyone with eyes to see could see. But so often, white churchgoers and church leaders in America have happily blinded themselves to. Peace, peace, they say, where there is no peace. It's time to stop declaring that there is peace and open our eyes so that we can start working to create peace and justice where there obviously is none. Dr. Hart illustrates this blindness early on in the book with an anecdote about a meeting he had with a white suburban pastor at a McDonald's. The pastor places a cup between the two of them and says that while he can see the words on his side, Drew can only see the logo on the other. And so they must dialogue to learn one another's perspective and see the whole picture. Dr. Hart points out that in order to survive in the world that he lives in, he of course knows what's on the far side of the cup. Having been raised on white Eurocentric history, philosophy, art, and music, and lived his life consuming white-dominated art forms as well through television and other media. In fact, Dr. Hart points out not knowing the white side of the story would have penalized him in the society, and certainly he wouldn't be well on his way to a doctorate at the time. However, the white pastor has had no obligation to ever learn what was on Drew's side of the cup, and would never have any fear of being held back for not knowing about black culture, for not learning from black intellectuals, for not understanding black history or theology. And this is likewise true of any other marginalized group's relationship to the dominant culture. White supremacy assumes that white is default. White is what must be known in order to appear normal, smart, or well-adjusted. There is no equal both sides divide. There is a vertical racial hierarchy that must be abolished to be fixed, because no amount of nailing 2x4s to the wall is going to fix a foundation built on the sand of oppression. Dr. Hart also just released a new book at the beginning of September called Who Will Be a Witness? It's a book on how the church can respond to social and political injustices that have been so often perpetrated and perpetuated in the name of Christianity. I'm certain it will be featured on a future episode of this show. Though the final chapter of The Troubles I've Seen begins to deal with that same topic of what can and really must be done by the church in concrete ways. And as such, it is an invaluable resource to any Christian. I absolutely recommend that anyone who claims Christ read this book. But there's plenty in this book that is important to a non-Christian audience as well. Particularly, there's a bit in chapter 2 that I found so enlightening that I'd like to share it with you in its entirety, where Dr. Hart speaks to accusations against someone playing the race card. What follows are Dr. Hart's words. At the heart of the accusation that someone is playing the race card is the suggestion that African American interpretation of an event is unduly subjective or has been manipulated. There is a long history going all the way back to slavery of white Americans not trusting black perspectives as truthful. Therefore, white verification is required to confirm every black thought and testimony, because on their own they hold no weight in court or public opinion. White perception is assumed to be more accurate and objective than black perception. Because she or he has categorized an event as racial in nature, the African American speaker must be called out and dismissed. What I would like to suggest is this: white folks are the only ones considering a single card. White people typically are obsessed with interpreting the meaning of individual cards or incidents. They look at the isolated card and then judge it by their whims and assumptions, which, no surprise, rarely ever find white people to be racist. For 400 years, in any given era, the white dominant group has always created a definition for their generation that absolved them from charges of wrongdoing and racism while reaffirming their innocence amid ongoing white domination and control over society and further racial oppression. The white dominant standard of racial discernment rarely finds white racism, while simultaneously deciding that the specific card played was falsely made into a race card. An individual moment, event, or action is judged by looking for KKK rhetoric, or maybe the N-word, or some cross burning in the yard. If such overt hate crimes prominent in the early and mid-20th century are not currently present or visible, then the racial component of the complaint is quickly dismissed. Unlike the dominant culture's tunnel vision that focuses on one card, the black community is usually considering the entire deck. That is, ongoing history and current widespread social patterns. We have laid out all the cards in front of us on the table. Rather than zooming in on one card, we have zoomed out to look at all the cards laid out together. All of a sudden, just like in any deck, you begin to observe the patterns. 4 aces, 4 kings, 4 queens, and 4 jacks. Our definition of racism is not based on a definition that dominant society both has created and continues to wield to deny any wrongdoing. No, we refuse to play their game, even if we work with their cards. Instead, it is only after looking at reoccurring patterns, studying the whole pack, and then gathering the entire deck and putting it back in order that we claim to make sense of any individual card. We aren't playing the race card, we are analyzing the racialized deck. It is this very act, the careful and patient observation of systemic racial components of our society, that the majority of white America has refused to engage in, choosing to trust their own intuitions and personal subjective assessments, which are socialized in dominant culture. Many white Americans focus on an individual card rather than attempt to make sense of how that card fits into the larger deck. So you want to play cards? Well, let's fix the rules of the game and recognize that black people aren't playing the race card. Typically, dominant society has been consumed by a single card, while most people in the African American community have been working with the entire racialized deck. And what we have always known is that the deck is stacked against us. Wow.